Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I know it's a busy time of the year. We really appreciate you being here. We're really excited to be working with you all on this project. This meeting is a closed meeting, so all the people attending are people participating in the project. I wanted to thank you for all the time you already invested in going through the assessment process, the farm environmental assessment process. Before we get into it, I wanted to formally introduce myself. I know I've been sending emails and text messages, but some of you do not really know me personally. So I'm Zaira Zamudio. I'm the Sustainable Farming Practices Manager at Riverine Plains, and I'm going to be your main point of contact for this project. This session is designed for you, so we wanted to make it very useful for you. So please feel free to put your question in the chat during the session, and we're going to try to get back to you during the Q&A open discussion time that we have. So for today's session, what we wanted to really do is give an introduction of the project. We're going to have Ed Scott going through the carbon project's fundamentals, what opportunities are in this space, and what benefits you could be generating for your farm. Then we're going to have Sam from GX Lab going through the farm environmental assessment you've been working on and how you can use it. And then we're going to have the Q&A session where you can just, we wanted to make it very conversational and try to give you answers to all the questions you have. And then we're going to tell you what's the next step coming for this project. So I just wanted to introduce the team now. From Riverine Plains is myself, Zaira. So I'm going to be your main point of contact for the project. So if you have any questions, concerns, please feel free to just send me an email or give me a phone call. I will be available from Monday to Friday. Then we have field systems. We have Ed Scott. He is our soil scientist. So he's going to be in charge of all the helping us designing your carbon projects and assessing the opportunities you could generate on your properties. From GX Lab, we have today Sam, but as part of the team, there is also Oli and Jade. I think Oli and Jade were the people who were in contact with you in the previous weeks, running your environmental farm assessments. And from Mari LLS, we have Kathleen and Beck joining the call today. So they're going to be helping us with technical support. These four groups are the groups that will be supporting you through the project. This project is funded by the New South Wales Government, and it's aiming at supporting farmers to unlock natural capital value on their properties. What we wanted to do is just to see if there are natural capital opportunities on your property, identify those, see which one of those are better or more suitable for you to get into a carbon project, whether it'll be soil carbon project or environmental carbon projects, or if your farm is not feasible for a carbon project, we will also like to explore other avenues if there are. So this is a farm first approach. So we're looking at productivity and resilience first, and the carbon is an added bonus for this main approach that we're taking. And as part of this project, every farm gets a free environmental assessment from GX Lab. That's a process you're all going through at the moment. So this farm environmental assessment, Sam is going to talk a little bit more about it later, but it essentially measures your farm carbon potential and informs you of what are the opportunities you could explore. And then the second part of the project will be working closely with Ed Scott and the people from Mari LLS in trying to design a carbon project that is suitable for your farm, or if a carbon project is not something that you could be exploring or that it's not suitable for your own system, we're going to assess why is that. The project runs from January 2026 till December 2028, and we're working across 5 different regions. This is the map of the regions we're covering or working with. Murrumbidgee Irrigation Fringe, Federation, Berrigan, Greater Hume-Shire, and Lockhart. These are the 4 stages that we're going to be going through. So at the moment we are in stage 1, which is the scoping and co-design. This stage will run until October this year. So what we're going to be doing is farm selection, running co-design workshops, visiting your farms. We're going to be working on designing your carbon projects and building some tools along with you and the team that could be useful for you to assess the opportunities in this space. The stage 2 will be landscape planning and feasibility. So we're going to be mapping farms and planning sites. We're going to be testing technologies, assessing feasibility, and preparing guides and paperwork for those ready to register, because it'll be up to you to register the project. We're going to be supporting you up until you get a project ready for registration, but then the next stage is just up to you whether you would like to register the project or not. Then we're going to go to stage 3, that is market engagement and modeling. We're going to be running some farm trials, collecting data, and exploring market opportunities. And we're going to be drafting case studies. So we want to generate case studies to help other farmers to understand how all this system works. And stage 4 is just knowledge sharing and close out. So we're going to be sharing the case studies through the Riverine Plains network and across all our channels. Now I would like to introduce Ed. He's going to be taking us through what is a carbon project and what does it mean for a farmer in Australia nowadays. So thank you, Ed. Could you introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us a little bit about you, what do you do, and your role in this project?
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. And yeah, thank you everyone for your participation in this project. It's really exciting to be a part of a project such as this and really work through with a number of growers on the journey around carbon projects and what it might mean for your farm and your overall plan going forward. So yep, my background is in soil and crop advisory and worked on carbon projects that have been both registered as part of the ACCU scheme as well as running unofficial carbon projects in line with the methodology and also stepping into some of the Scope 3 emissions monitoring work as well. I'm South Australian based, but have worked a significant amount of time across the Riverine catchment, and it's great to be working with the team on this project with you all. So what we really want to get across today is that within the carbon project space, there can be a lot of noise and hard to sometimes find the right avenues to go down to find a reliable source of truth around what it means for your farm and the direction it could go within a carbon project. So really want to touch on some of that today. And I guess as you start linking that together with the environmental assessment that's been done by GX Lab, hopefully it'll all start coming together. And ultimately in a month's time, we'll be having a face-to-face workshop where hopefully over the next 4 weeks, you'll be thinking about your own farm business, what method may work and start planning out. And then we can deep dive into a bit more when we're face-to-face at the workshops. So what we want to do is sort of step through some of the ACCU fundamentals. What is an ACCU and where it all sits to generate them. Link that into 2 of the main focus points around soil carbon projects, as well as what's called the environmental planting projects. And then we want to be thinking about what those benefits are to your and considerations for your business. So working through some of the ACCU fundamentals. What is an ACCU? And ultimately, when we talk about ACCUs, It's a bit of jargon in the space, but we're talking about a Australian carbon credit unit. So you might see when you go and do your own sort of research, bit of Googling around, you might see ERF, or Emissions Reduction Fund, which was sort of the name it was processed through or promoted through the ERF, but it's really been labelled as the ACCU scheme now around these carbon projects. So ultimately, we've got two sides of the coin here. We're trying to generate ACCUs, which are there to essentially be generated to offset the Australian emissions targets, which really is, when we look at the agricultural production systems, there are opportunities that sit within that space, but it's trying to understand where is the fit for a business, managing the opportunities around the lowest risk and highest opportunities for you as landowners, and where that sits. So there is one silver lining in the whole carbon space, is that we've got something finally going in the favour of agricultural production systems, where a multiplier goes in the favour of, for the likes of soil carbon. When we look at that 1 tonne of soil carbon, when we talk about it today, actually is equivalent to 3.67 ACCUs. So whenever you see that multiplier, or you want to be looking at, are they referring to CO2 equivalents when you see how people are reporting versus soil organic carbon, for argument's sake. So there's a lot of common terms been thrown around in the space, but it's just one of those little catch-alls in there, just being aware of, are we talking about a CO2 equivalent, which is what an ACCU is, so 1 tonne of carbon dioxide, but that is actually equivalent to 1 tonne of soil carbon, for argument's sake, is equal to 3.67 ACCUs. So thinking about how that multiplier can benefit there. When we start thinking about a project, we've got a bit of a stepwise process to work through, and that's ultimately what this whole program is going to be framed around, is working through some of these steps. And ultimately, part of it where I've been more heavily involved with some of the projects is developing what's called a land management strategy, which is really what your farm's going to be implementing over the next few years in the project. But that's actually not a bad process to go through, whether you're going into a carbon project or not. Thinking about your asset base, being the land, thinking about it from a strategic point of view of saying what's happening on that land over the next 25 years and what sort of changes you might want to see in your landscape is a good way to just reflect on your own business and landscape in general, without getting too caught up in shouldn't go into a carbon project. Ultimately, working through these steps, that will declare itself quite naturally on where that fits within the landscape and your business. So we're all here to help support that on that journey. So as we work through it, we'll be stepping through today, just looking at some of the methods, what it takes to register the project, and we'll go into this in more detail in some of the workshops as well, what it takes to implement and monitor. There is some reporting and auditing that is required going into a ACCU scheme project. It is a financial instrument. You are generating financially tangible units, being an ACCU. And so we've got to be aware of that through this whole process. So let's start with soil carbon. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion around soil carbon throughout Australia, and through southern New South Wales, certainly, around some activity in that space. And really, the opportunity here is trying to think about where's my current soil carbon levels at, and where might they be going in the future, and is that worth framing up into a project? So the devil's in the location a little bit, and the environment you're in when we talk about soil carbon. And when we talk about soil carbon, we want to be starting to think about the overall soil's capacity. We here and go down different rabbit holes on how much soil carbon soils can hold and store and all of that. But what we want to be starting to think about is, realistically, when we reflect on our own soils on our properties, what is the potential there? And that potential of the organic carbon storage is really governed mostly by the soil type and how that's framed up. So generally, the higher clay content soils can hold and store more carbon. The bulk density is related to how compacted that soil is, so how tight that soil is, and how the overall volume of that soil that we're measuring, and the depth of the soil profile. So we'll go over it again, but the minimum requirement for a soil carbon project is actually to do a soil sample over 0 to 30 centimetres. But many people who have registered projects then do a second sample on that same site, where it gets split down to 30 centimetres to a metre or beyond. And then we're actually measuring some of that deeper soil carbon as well. So that sets up what our potential organic carbon is, some of that soil type there. So that's inherently attributed to that landscape. What's then attainable is saying, well, what is that climate that is sitting over that soil type? So generally, the greater the rainfall and the heavier the soil type, the greater potential there is to store carbon. So that rainfall and temperature as well. And when we think about where are some of the highest carbon contents in the world, it's sitting in the peat bogs of Scotland, right? Cold, slow cycling of carbon, and we get strong accumulation over a long period of time. When we think of agricultural production, obviously we've got the ebb and flow of seasonality and rainfall and just the natural variation that occurs there. So we've got a ceiling that gets put on it, which is where some of the tropical environments have high amounts of rainfall but high temperatures, and the microbes just cycle that carbon round and through quite quickly. So it's actually difficult to store some carbon even in some high rainfall environments. So this is where we want to understand, and where that environmental assessment through GX Lab has really looked at where's your farm located, what's the rainfall, what's the soil type, and try to marry some of that together from a bit of a desktop study. And then the actual organic carbon here, what you can build is very much linked to your management. So you don't have a lot of control necessarily over your soil type or the climate that sits above it, but we do over the management. So this is the lever that we want to understand we can start pulling. So we want to think about what's our overall rotation, what does it look like? Do we have livestock? We've continuous cropping. Where is that setting up in the system to work out what can actually be stored as far as carbon? Then we want to be thinking about what is your land eligible ultimately. So what we want to be thinking about, what do we want to have together and start thinking about what we've got to pull together for a project is what we want to understand is what's happened on that property for the last 5 years. And that's considered your baseline period of management ultimately, is saying what has been business as usual over the last 5 years of your land use. So want to have a good understanding of that. So people who are running the likes of a ag world or an operations center, field ops or some of their machinery and that side of things might have some of this data already collated there. And it's really just trying to have it into a central point, because a big thing going forward is going to be how you manage your data going forward for making reporting and the like simpler in the future. Sampling depth, as I mentioned before, we've got a sampling depth minimum requirement to be to 30 centimetres. So that's where some of the shallower soil types or rocky soils, I don't think we captured too many of them in this subset, but something to consider around that because, we've got that minimum requirement around that 30 centimetres. Ultimately, we want to be seeing that carbon potential improving. So we want to be thinking about back to your soil type and that environment, and realistically, what can we change in your farm business? So from linking this additionality and with that genuine improvement potential is saying, what levers can we pull to potentially increase soil carbon content on that property in a given time frame? So what are some of those additionality points? So change of practice or additionality will be used interchangeably in some different documents out there in the marketplace and through the Clean Energy Regulator website. And we'll share some links around after this call for a bit more pre-reading before our workshops. But additionality is thinking about a practice change. And these practice changes have been prescribed in the methodology. So you have to choose something from this list. And the reason why that is essentially there's adequate research sitting behind some of these practice changes to verify that they have been associated with an increase in soil carbon through research that's been conducted using these intervention practices. Ultimately, you might be doing some of these practices already on farm. And if you are, that will be considered as business as usual. So many people in the Riverine, say, have started already applying lime to remediate acidic soils. That's fine if you've already done that. That's not a bad thing. What we would then do is look to say, what else are we looking to do? We might be doing some extra soil testing. Fine, we've actually got some other nutrient deficiencies. You might have really good phosphorus, really good nitrogen, but your sulfur might be lacking. So we might find there's a general trend there of different nutrients, which might be putting a handbrake on why your system may not be in such a carbon positive building direction now and where that direction will go. So think about this, especially some good opportunities around, especially changing from cropping back to pasture. Obviously, you've got plants in the ground for longer and the perennial nature of them might be linking back into rotation. So Speaking to some growers, might be on a longer wheat canola sort of phase where they might be thinking about introducing legumes back into the rotation. And if we're thinking about a change of practice in our farm business, that is a prime opportunity to assess whether it aligns with a soil carbon project opportunity as well. So ultimately, you don't have to choose just one. You can have multiple of these which are assigned to different areas of the field, which we'll go into it in more detail. But be just thinking about what you might be already thinking about might be opportunities in the pipeline. If you had that opportunity to introduce a management change, this may help you on that direction for going down that road. So ultimately, we have to do something different or additional to what we've done over the past 5 years. So what do some of these additionalities lead to as far as carbon building potential? And really, this is where sort of some of the numbers which will align with some of the potential put out in your environmental assessment reports, which will be looking at what your potential carbon build is. And that's looking at your climate, your soil types, and then linking back to potential management changes as well. But something like some of this research been collated, a table from Suze Orgel, who's done a huge amount of work through that southern New South Wales region, but looking at sort of a snapshot of what some of the carbon sequestration rates have been in pasture and crop management. Something like liming has been led to around 460 to 550 kilos of carbon per hectare per year. So we can start looking at that over a 5-year period, what that might add up to. But what we might see is there might be a plateau after a certain amount of time. So once you lime, you might have that management change, then you might need to add something else again to keep on a positive trajectory. When you work your way through the likes of rotational grazing, is seeing, once you're introducing that back through for the grazing operators, might be going from set stocking to rotational grazing, might see around 350 kilograms per hectare per year. Some of the grazing management, especially through some of the medium to higher rainfall area, has been up to over a tonne per hectare per year, which this is in tonnes of soil carbon. So a tonne of carbon actually be 3.67 ACCUs per hectare over that window. So something like in the cropping scenarios, cropping ultimately has lower potential than what a pasture system does. But that is not saying that you shouldn't necessarily be doing it. I think you're just going to be sitting between probably 50 kilos through to 300 kilos is probably sort of the range that a lot of the modelling has been worked on. So once we just start thinking about what some of those additionalities are, we can think about what can work through on the back of the envelope as you potentially look down the road of going into a carbon project. Then what will happen is once you assess sort of some of that additionality, then that gets framed up into working out, understanding your farm and turning into what's called carbon estimation areas, which are linked back to ultimately management. So you might have some areas which are continuous cropping, and you might have some areas which are more dedicated grazing areas or a bit of a hybrid. And so you might link that back to 3 carbon estimation areas. So your continuous cropping area, because it's all been managed the same, might be 1 carbon estimation area. And your pasture country might be another carbon estimation area. What that does is help align management and potential changes in carbon and the rates of what those carbon will change. Try and group them with like, right? And then within that, is what then is called stratification, where that then gets broken down into the different subsets of maybe soil type or landscape features, which may impact some of that carbon distribution in the landscape. So most of the projects that are going through are worked on soil carbon physical measurements. So that's so a minimum requirement is to have 9 samples done per CEA, per carbon estimation area. So if you have multiple carbon estimation areas, you need a minimum of 9 samples, so soil cores per CEA. And ultimately, what can also then be happening is within 5 years, you then have to remeasure, and you report that remeasurement, and that's tracked on within 5-year basis. Some people do it closer than that in year tenure, but others are sticking to around that sort of 5-year repeat window. There is also a hybrid model and measurement where baselining is done, and then some remote sensing work can be done to model out, which can be beneficial for minimizing some of the ongoing costs in sampling, because the sampling costs can add up, can be a significant cost in the project. So as I touched on, the monitoring cycle is basically there'll be a baselining that's done. The practice change then happens after that baselining has occurred. That resampling will occur within 5 years, and then you'll be reporting on those project emissions, and then there'll be a audit required over the time of the, or multiple audits required over the time of the project. So that's just really the steps we're going through. So part of this will be planning that out and stepping through where the fit is for your business. What I just want to touch on is when you start, so you might go back and start having a look at your own soil tests. And like I said, it's different areas will have different potentials. And if you do, there's some sort of back of the envelope calculations you can run yourself. So when we talk about carbon, we actually don't talk about percentage carbon, which is, we talk about the percentage of carbon quite commonly on a normal soil test. You might get it back and you've got 2% organic carbon or 1% organic carbon on your soil test. What we've got to convert that to is a stock value, which is the tons of carbon per hectare. So what you can do is get your own soil tests and grab that percentage carbon and sort of do a bit of a back of the envelope example. So if, for argument's sake, you had soil organic carbon levels of 1% on your soil test, you had a bulk density, so how tight your soil is 1.3, quite commonly is around 1.3, 1.4 grams per centimetre cube, or basically for a metre cubed or like an IBC of a cube of soil would weigh about 1.3 tonnes, right? 1.3, 1.4. So you multiply it by that and by your depth of your sample. So if you have a 0 to 10 centimetre test, I need to multiply it by the 10 centimetres, but over a 30 centimetre sample, this is what we'll be looking at. So you'll have your 1% times by your 1.3 times by your 30 comes out to about 39 tonnes of carbon per hectare, right? I think that helps put into perspective around what we then need to think about if we're building carbon at 0.5 tonne per hectare per year, how long it might actually take till we see a true detectable change over time. So if you go and add 5 tonnes, so a tonne per hectare per year, and add 5 tonnes of carbon, you'll be going to from 39 up to 44 tonnes of carbon over potentially that first sort of window, right? So thinking about how that, making the numbers make sense, because realistically, the carbon that you're going to store has been built from the biomass production that you're growing as part of your pasture or cropping production system. Then once that is there, not all carbon that you build is going to stay there. So we've got different forms of that carbon. It can be stored as particulate organic matter, so it cycles through a little bit more quickly, and then you've got what's called mineral-associated organic matter. And we can send some resources around just understanding that not all carbon is stored equal, and we can have some of this carbon, we can build it, but it can deplete as quickly as we build it as well. And that's what we'll see. Cropping systems are a relatively balanced kind of system as well in that space. So over that time, what we'll be then doing is within that baseline period, we'll be looking at what that carbon measurement was. And then when we come back and remeasure, you want to be seeing ideally an increase in carbon. If your management change attracted an increase in emissions, so even putting out something like lime does release CO2 when it reacts in the soil. So even something like that we have to account for. And then what we do is what gets reported is your total emissions, and they may go up, may go down, may stay the same, and put that against your overall stock value increase, and we'll get a net abatement measurement there. So that's what will ultimately gets reported, and that's what you'll get awarded on. Ultimately, without getting too bogged down, there are some discounts that are attracted, just risk of reversal factors and alike going through this process, but that's what ultimately we'll step through. So part of the next step, if the soil carbon project was of interest to you, there are some basic steps, like I touched on, that we'll need to be going through from that planning perspective, the registration of the project, what's required to do that. So we want to be thinking about even getting your emissions side of things. We've got to know what you were doing in the 5 years prior and what inputs and outputs essentially have been generated from that. There's a process of delivering that project, so baselining, and then thinking about that reporting and crediting over time. So that's a bit of a snapshot on the soil carbon projects. Second part of this is thinking about the environmental plantings. And for many of you, this may be a more suitable fit or an adaptable fit for your system. So when we think about environmental plantings, this is essentially allocating areas where trees can be replanted, essentially reforested areas. Quite often it aligns quite well with shelter belt plantings or allocating areas that are poorer performing from a production side of things, which may be a good fit to replant, and think about how it fits in with animal husbandry, landscape health, salinity management, all that. There are multiple effects that can lead to a benefit of an environmental planting system. So ultimately, we're talking about land that has ultimately been cleared, not just thickening up a forested area or something that was going to naturally regenerate anyway. There is a minimum planting density. So we've got to think about the density of the plantings for them. So belt plantings around 800 stems per hectare and block plantings around 200 stems per hectare. Which then are aligned with, depending on your rainfall, the tree species that will be going in there, but they're essentially a native/mallee eucalypt-based design. The full cam coverage, so this monitoring is done through modelling work around tree growth and carbon sequestration from vegetation, which ultimately you've all fallen within the full cam measurement regions for GX Lab to be able to generate their reports out of it. So ultimately, there's a similar process with the environmental plantings, with planning out the area for them where they might go. But there is a updated approach to the program that if you had an area that was between 0.2 and 200 hectares on your property that could be allocated to a environmental planting, it attracts less of a audit and compliance component than what a larger project may require or does require. So which I think is potentially quite a good fit for a number of the properties who've been part of the initial scoping in this project, where might, like I say, align with planned shelter belt areas, or dealing with problematic areas or underperforming areas of the field, which may be more suited or more beneficial to the farm business to have as an environmental planting area. Stepping through that is that it becomes ultimately become a self-managed environmental planting carbon project. So you lodge the area that has been assessed. You'll be modelled out, and they'll be remotely monitored by satellite, and then some tag photos for your own reporting with it as well. So ultimately is a lower risk pathway for that. So if you do some reading on the environmental plantings, think about there have been some updates just around that sizing of the area and what it means for your business. As I touched on, very similar sort of pathway where we ultimately still have to plan and map. So the farm planning element is an important step. There'll be the fencing and preparation of the site, planting, and then the establishment and monitoring, because trees can be challenging to establish. I'm sure many of you have been involved with some tree plantings, and they can be temperamental depending on the seasons as well. So something to think about. It's not always a free kick planting a tree. There does be some love and nurturing that goes in with it. So when we think about sort of that planning as well, think about your own business. It doesn't have to be, you're not locking up large tracts of country. This is around being strategic with how it fits in with your landscape, the overall hydrology of your landscape. Where are some where are areas where trees might be beneficial features within the landscape from a overall landscape health and farm functionality point of view. So the environmental planting side of it does provide for some see it as a lower risk opportunity than some of the soil carbon-based approaches, but soil carbon-based approaches do provide a good template for overall sort of soil health tracking as well. So the big thing with trees, we've got that phase over the first sort of 3 years on getting them established, right? And ultimately what we'll see is over that period, the trees will be relatively steady on their modelled growth. And then overall, once they start getting established and into their main growth phase, they will be ultimately their highest accumulation window will be leading through into generally that sort of 5 to 25 year period, depending on the tree species. So something to think about as that grows up and starts plateauing over time. it's that can be monitored and essentially gets modelled out, and you can assess how much potential your landscape has based on the area for those tree plantings. So as we start thinking about it, sort of weighing up where some of the fit might be with soil carbon versus environmental plantings, is really soil carbon is ultimately better modelled and higher confidence in areas with greater than 500 millimetres of rainfall. Not saying that if you're lower than that, you shouldn't go into a carbon project. I think it's just managing the expectation on how much carbon you'll be able to build and the impacts of drought and all that sort of thing can have on some of the carbon sequestration potential. However, as a framework, like I was saying, provides a good template for your overall farm planning and management. When we start thinking about the environmental plantings, a lot of the times they're very complementary to the overall farm planning going forward. When we talk about, so like I was saying, the shelter belts, like animal husbandry benefits and overall even wind impact on the landscape and the like, they can, and drainage, they can have significant impact or like positive impact on that. Talk about time to first ACCUs. So ultimately the carbon projects, soil carbon projects will need to be, like I touched on, measured within 5 years. And it's unknown essentially how much you will build, but that can be essentially modelled out on what the expectation will be there. And like the environmental plantings mentioned before, can be slower to get going, but can be modelled out a bit more structured going forward once those trees are established. Soil carbon, there's a lot more that happens over this 25 plus year period, just constantly more touch points over every 5 years at a minimum, doing the sampling, where the environmental plantings is more of a significant setup, especially with the fencing and the planting, but then it's more just more remote sort of monitoring from there. I think it's your own reflection around the potential of the land use impact, but overall soil carbon projects are not there to essentially lock up your land, neither are the trees. It's there to be complementary to the landscape and overall production system. Soil carbon projects do attract some costs with the soil sampling, analysis and ongoing audits, and that'll depend on the size of the project, obviously, and which is where, again, you can be assessing your own business whether you're more suited to be a self-proponent, so lodge the project yourself, or you may be a better fit for a project developer or aggregator from there. So, like what Sarah mentioned at the start, we want to be thinking about what this project can, being part of a carbon project, can deliver, and that's going to vary for each business, but thinking about what that may be. But ultimately, we want the overall farm productivity and profitability there first, but the carbon projects, when set up, can provide certainly opportunities for income streams, but also greater productivity gains and resilience in the landscape. So as we just sort of wrap this up, just some considerations is when we talk about carbon projects, they have a minimum requirement of being 25 years. So some people, that's a bit disconcerting. However, when you think about your overall farm plan, I think this is where it needs to align with your overall planning and succession as well around that. The 25-year options do take discounts on the amount of carbon credits that'll be issued. So they'll discount by 20% on that issuance because there's an uncertainty of what's going to happen over that next 75 years. There are options for 100-year projects, but generally more projects have been opted for the 25-year option. But we can unpack that a little bit further, but the permanence side of it, when you read up more around that, is around how long this project will be essentially operating for, because ultimately once the project's set up, we want that carbon to stay there in the soil or in the vegetation. So questions for your next steps. What I want you to think about, especially before our next workshops, is ultimately which method may be a fit or is of interest to you and you want to assess more if it does have a fit. How is it going to fit into my farm business and overall future plans, and is there alignment? Think about who's bearing the risk. It all comes back to the landholder around where the drought and then loss of carbon comes back to. Ultimately, it's not too onerous. You just need to get it back to a point of making good again. So if you built carbon and it does decrease, you're not penalised directly there. It is just saying you won't be awarded any more credits until you get back to where your last measurement was. Think about what your overall carbon yield might be, which is where the GX Lab project has been able to provide some of these insights around what the ACCU, so carbon credit yield, might potentially be on your place. Think about how that permanence period aligns with your overall farm direction. And for different size projects, we can unpack further around what some of those ongoing costs are, but it all comes down to the size of the project is going to extrapolate that out. So ultimately, that's a bit of a wrap and a snapshot from me. As Sarah mentioned, we're part of this sort of stepping through growers, making sure that you're comfortable on the way through of how these projects may fit into your business and guide you on stepping through the potential to lodge those projects yourself or point you in the right direction to get further support on how a carbon project may align with your landscape, property and overall farm business direction. So I really appreciate the opportunity and looking forward to meeting up with you further at some of the workshops and really being able to unpack this and really get a better understanding of your properties and how there can be some alignment with the carbon projects going forward. As I mentioned, love to have some questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll pick up for a Q&A afterwards. But to run through some of your assessments and how to interpret your assessments, I'm going to hand over to Sam Duncan from GX Lab. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Ed. We need to take a breath after all that information. There's a lot then.
Yes.
You don't have to remember it all. I think Sarah's recording this, so if you walked away for a cuppa, you can always come back to it. Look, I will. So, how would I start with intros? Sam Duncan. We used to be Farm Lab. We've changed our name to GX Lab. So some of you may have heard of us. Why the name change? That's a completely different story I won't go into just yet. But the long and short of it is that we sort of expanded our technology into soil remediation as well as soil carbon and soil sort of agronomy-based, ag-based work there too. We started in 2018, I started the business with the hypothesis that if farmers had better soil data, they could better manage soil carbon. And here we are today, presented to a group of fantastic producers about soil carbon using soil data. So my background, I'm not a farmer, I'm ex-Air Force, did a lot of work in logistics and data, which actually has a lot to do with soil sampling, as I've learned over the years. And yeah, really stoked to be here. So I think as Ed's mentioned, our role in the project is really providing you guys with a bit of a snapshot of your farm. I'm kind of thinking as Ed was talking about what the analogy is with the snapshot, right? And I think the best way to describe it is what we're going to give you is a bit of it's kind of like a Fitbit. Does anyone use a Fitbit? It's kind of like using a Fitbit, right? Like it's not, it's going to be a look at your farm as far as its carbon potential goes for environmental plantings and soil carbon using a satellite and a few remotely sensed data sets, as well as some a significant amount of research and data that were collected around the region goes. It's not going to be as detailed as a blood test, which equate to a soil sample, actually getting soil samples done on your property. But that would be the next phase. It is going to give you a left and right of arc and a broad scope around what your potential and what your feasibility might look like. I'll keep it brief and short, and I'll let you guys dive into the details during the Q&A session. What I want to show you first is what that report looks like. Ed, give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. Yep, excellent. So this is the report that we're doing for each and every one of you. It's a nice little title page. This is an example report. I'll fly through this and I'll talk through the fundamentals behind this. So by the end of this next 10 minutes, you will be experts in how to read this. And if you're not, don't worry, we'll do a deep dive with each of you on this. We start with the project summary. A few little charts there. I'll dig into what that all means shortly. We then have your environmental plantings potential. We then have levels of tree cover across your property. We go into soil carbon levels across your farm potential. We look at that potential converted into carbon credits over 25 years. Conclusion and the next steps. And there's a few nice little things we have at the end there. So this is a clay map. If you haven't seen a clay map of your property, this comes from I'll talk about that in a second. Rainfall chart over the last 20 years, average monthly rainfall. You all know why that's important. As Ed said, 500 mils is really the sweet spot we want, for carbon projects. And they're just some of these terms and a bit of a disclaimer. Cool. All right, let me jump into the presentation. We'll do a bit more of a dive into what each of those charts means. So a bit of background here first. A lot of what we've put into this has come out of the last really 8-9 years of development of the platform and the data. We've got about 5,000 field samples today that go into some of the models that you're about to see, some of the maps. Our history as well, throughout our history, we've seen hundreds of ACCU-based projects. About 30% of Australia's soil carbon credit projects are run using our software. And so we've experienced a lot, and we've helped a lot of farmers throughout these processes. Ed's touched on the high-level aspects of these ACCU projects and we'll focus on two pathways in particular, being soil carbon and environmental plantings. I'm a bit biased because I started this business around, with the focus of soil carbon. So I do really like soil carbon as an avenue for ACCU-based production, because you don't take farmland out of production to do it. You're still generating a farm income, some farm revenue, but you're also stacking on those ACCUs. So I really like this. I really like it as an ACCU-based method. It's come a long way in the last 10, 15 years. So as I said, a lot of this data comes from real measurements from around your farms, not necessarily your properties, unless you were involved in some of the National Soil Carbon Innovation Challenge projects we developed these models out of. We will be looking at your specific property, soil, clay, rainfall, and canopy coverage for your farm when we do these assessments. Rainfall comes from long-term silo estimate records, which is a BOM Queensland Government product. And we'll be pretty honest about your limits. Like we talk about this in terms of feasibility and potential. Feasibility is, does this suit you and your farming operation with your average clay levels, your rainfall, and your soil type? Potential is, where do you sit relative to where you could potentially be at? And they are two different things. I know Ed had that great chart there. Thanks for sharing that, Ed. That was really interesting. And we'll dive into that specifically for your properties there. So like I said, this is our farm assessment. It's that high level kind of Fitbit approach to looking at soil and looking at carbon potential. That first piece here on feasibility, which you'll see up front, is based on really, is this a feasible thing for you to be doing? What's the analogy? Is it? So it's kind of like looking at somebody and saying, all right, they've got long legs, long arms. They'd be a great marathon runner. They're 6'5". But is it necessarily feasible for them to spend all that time training for a marathon? If you run a marathon, I haven't, but it's definitely not feasible for me to run a marathon. I have very short legs. It's probably not feasible. If you might have the potential to run a marathon, but if you don't have the time, if you don't have the resources to put into it, well, it's not going to be feasible, right? And that's kind of what we're trying to explain here with this. If you don't, you might have potential to run a carbon project, but if you're not at that rainfall mark, if you don't have a large enough area, and if your clay is not high enough, then it may not be particularly feasible for you to invest the money in a carbon project. So, to the next slide. Wanted to start with maybe a macro level look at soil carbon, just to sort of situate everyone with, I guess, some of the nuances of soil carbon here. So, does anyone want to just really quickly, can anyone see, there's some really clear trends here, right? So what's happening to the east, the plains? Can everyone understand this? So blue is high, red is low. Feel free to jump in and shout out if you want. We're getting higher or lower in carbon the further east we go in the region. I assume higher. Higher, exactly. Thank you. And and this is really interesting, right? Because actually, when you overlay this with the clay map, clay tends to drop off. And so, we kind of have this inverse reality when it comes to soil carbon. We have lower levels of clay, probably scraggier land, poorer land up into the sort of the snowies in the east across here. But why might that be the case? Why in poorer landscapes do we have higher levels of soil carbon? Does anyone want to have a guess? Jump in. I'll give you the answer. I'll give you what I think is the answer anyway. Well, it's management. It's management, right? Are we necessarily cropping those areas? No, but probably grazing, right? So we saw in Ed's chart earlier that grazed land is generally high levels of soil carbon. If you're looking to get that bang from bigger boost in soil carbon from a cropping system, you'll generally convert to a grazing system. But what if you're already in that grazing system, or you're probably higher in soil carbon than a neighbor or than the regions that are predominantly cropped? And that's what this map here really does a good job at showing, I think, is, you've got, particularly in the west, heavily cropped areas, in the east, really predominantly grazed, and probably primarily woody areas here too. So it's just something to just keep in the back of your mind when it comes to the maps that we'll show you. We'll provide you with for soil carbon in these reports. So that's the first little bit. I'll just, can everyone still see my screen? I think, there we go. So soil organic carbon. So we'll give you the first one's pretty straightforward. It's a map of soil carbon, similar to what I showed you in the previous slide. So that's giving you a wall-to-wall estimate of carbon already in your soil, as Ed said, to 30 centimeters. Red is low, green is high, and the model was developed using over 5,000 0 to 30 centimeter soil carbon measurements that we painstakingly coordinated across Australia. So we did this a lot around Riverine Plains, up to northern New South Wales, northern Victoria, across every state around Australia. And all of that data has gone into this as part of the National Soil Carbon Innovation Challenge to give what is Australia's highest resolution soil carbon map. And now we're bringing it to you guys thanks to Riverine Plains. And that's a really important basis. That is a really important basis for the potential, which we'll get to in a second. We have an environmental plantings map. So this is really talks about the bang for buck that you get for planting trees across your farm. Red, this is all modeled. So this is what the government says they will award you if you plant trees in these areas. So red is low, you get a low amount of ACCUs per hectare planted, and green is high. In this case, in this little map here, you can see this little green belt across here. If I were to plant that area out, let's say 800 stems per hectare, as Ed said, I'd get about 12 tons, 11.8 tons per hectare. Now, that's not measured, that will just be credited. So I'm much better off planting that green area than I am, let's say, that red area there, where I'll only get awarded 4.2 tons. So quite an interesting little graph here. This should help identify some of those planting zones. So we work with Renovo Ag to bring this data set to you. We have tree cover, which is really essential. Tree cover is going to give you your dark green tree cover is areas greater than 20% canopy cover across your farm. So particularly for those farmers here that have a few trees across their property, this is going to help identify those areas. Now, importantly, why is that? Why does that matter? Well, and I saw a bit of discussion there. We can dig into this, but no, you can't be retrospectively awarded for any environmental plantings that you've done in the past. So these areas do unfortunately have to be excluded from ACCU plantings. And Ed, please correct me if I'm wrong, but we can dig into this later. You also can't run a soil carbon project over these areas yet because we don't have the integrated land management strategy. And that's mainly because they're not seen as productive areas, and they're also relatively hard to measure what's actually happening in the soil around some of these trees. So we will provide that as the basis, and this is a building block. See, this is a building block layer for your project or for your feasibility study. Last but not least, we have the soil carbon potential map, and this is really trying to gauge that gap between what your soil carbon could be and what clay, in this case, says it should be, or its potential is. So the way this is built is we look at all of the areas of your farm and the carbon level, and we look at all the areas and we look at the clay levels. And we say, all right, for this area over, let's say in the green where we've got really high potential, that area there, we've actually got really low carbon, but clay is quite high. So we've got a bit of a gap there. So when clay's high and carbon's low, that gap is what we use to determine your potential. Straightforward. It's much more complicated than that. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into that, but I won't bore you with too much. I can dive into how we calculate that in the questions. Needless to say, there's actually a bit of University of Sydney research that goes into this to help us develop some of these tools to be able to do this. It's pretty cool. It's pretty new. Already spoken about that. From apps to a plan. Great. That's me. Hopefully that wasn't too boring. You're all awake. Yeah, good. So, look, I'll throw it back to you, Sarah, and happy to answer any questions. But that's what we'll take you through. So you've gone through the four maps now. Tree cover, soil carbon. Soil carbon's based on the 5,000 samples, so it's real data that we set in. We do a lot of machine learning and statistics that go into how to build that. Soil carbon potential and OCAM, the environmental plantings return. Cool. To you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ed and Sam. I hope everyone is okay. That was a lot of information, but as Ed said, we're recording this meeting and we're gonna be sharing the recording with everyone, so you can just revisit if you need to review some of the concepts. And we're gonna be touching on all of these topics again during our in-person workshops. So this meeting is just an introductory meeting, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what we're going to be covering, so you can just do your own research and come to the workshop with some questions that we can answer. Yeah, so I open up this space for you to ask all the questions. We have 2 questions already in the chat. I don't know if Sherlyn and Alistair wants to just jump and make the questions, or do you want me to read the questions? Up to you. Yeah. Do you want me to read your questions? There it is.
I can ask the question. I was waiting for
Yeah.
Cheryl. Should be ladies first. If you can hear me. Yeah, so to be just a little bit disappointing if we don't have credit or recognition for what we've done in the past. But I guess the obvious answer to me is we're trying to find a baseline. Our baseline would have been a lot lower 30 years ago, potentially. And we didn't do any of that work for carbon credits. It wasn't even thought of when we started. It was all done for increasing biodiversity and our own pleasure, I guess. But I would hope that there would be some credit for what we've done going forward. Is there something in the system that will do that for us?
Okay, I'll jump in, maybe start here, and I'll throw it over to Ed after. But my view is, Alistair, this is great because we come across this all the time. It's a real pain in the ass for us but we don't just deal in the ACCU scheme though, and there are other methods outside of the ACCU scheme. So the short answer is, in the ACCU scheme, no, you can't be retrospectively credited for stuff you've already done, because the ACCU scheme is a behavioural scheme. It's trying to pay people, farmers, and polluters and emitters, everyone out there, because it's not just an ag scheme, to change behaviour. Now, if your behaviour is already good, they're not going to pay you to change it because you're already abiding by the behaviour they need. And all this other data stuff that we showed you is really just kind of a side effect of having to measure that behavioural change. But it's a behavioural change protocol. So you just got to think about it in terms of that. If your behaviour's if you're already doing these things, it's kind of like, smokers, if you're a smoker out there, sorry, I'm going to think, it's kind of paying smokers not smoke. Well, what about the rest of us, right? And it's something that frustrates me, because we do see and we are involved in a lot of other projects outside Australia that are getting credits, and some retrospectively, for the work they've done. And they're building this into particularly insetting schemes, where they're building all the work that they've built up on over the last 15, 20 years, and able to sort of generate revenue off of that. Now, it's just not revenue through a carbon scheme. It's revenue through selling their product for a premium, because they're showing that you've got a sustainable sort of supply chain. Any thoughts on that from an ACCU perspective? Are we likely to see any reversal on that?
No, again, this is sort of linking back to, like I said, just that change of practice. And I just dropped in that link for the sort of an FAQ from the government website there, just sort of ticking off some of that. But yeah, unfortunately, existing plantings or even existing change of practices and stuff can't be recognised. But yeah, there are voluntary schemes and other programs that are available around that space. But as far as being eligible for an ACCU scheme project, it looks at where you are today and what you're going to do differently tomorrow. Was there any? Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I was going to say, look, the potential here is that if these plantings aren't, there are some other avenues. I won't talk about them too much, but if these plantings are native plantings, there's other schemes and there will be developments around particularly biodiversity credits and other bits and pieces that you can sort of reuse these existing natively planted areas out for. So there is definitely, I think that we'll see more of this in the future. There will be credit where credit's due for historic projects. It's just not through the building of carbon in this case.
Thanks so much, Ed and Sam. Yeah, so we're going to be looking at other avenues if the ACCU scheme is not something that fits your system. So we're going to be exploring more of that in those person workshop, because we're going to be looking at your specific farm and what we can do with your specific environmental assessment report. We're going to be looking at that and exploring what opportunities might suit your own property. So yeah, if a carbon project under the ACCU scheme is not feasible for you, we're going to be looking at other alternatives if you wanted to explore those.
And I think I'll just add here, Sarah, this is where actually having this data, knowing what areas are planted out with trees and other things is really crucial, because there's this term of natural capital. Has everyone heard of natural capital? It's not just carbon, it's kind of everything natural. So it's the biodiversity, it's everything else, right? There's been a lot of work done, groups like Farming for the Future. There's in-setting sustainability groups. We've been talking to Landcare about this as well. So if anyone knows Ange Hammond, about benchmarking, because if you have a natural capital score, it's not necessarily about it's not about necessarily behavioral change. It's about where you sit relative to others in your region and other farmers, with the amount of biodiversity you have across your farm, the amount of trees you've got planted. So again, this is very much the future of ag and farming. Right now, I think there's a lot of, these schemes, the ACCU scheme, which we're focusing on now, is behavioral change, but there are other mechanisms. And I think this benchmarking idea of being able to benchmark natural capital will help reward farmers that have been doing this for a while.
Thanks, Sam. Is there any other questions?
What about the obvious one? Does no one want to know the costs? Do you know how much costs are on a soil carbon project? Does anyone want to know that? Do you want me to spoil it, Sarah? I didn't tell everyone.
Yes, please. And also, how much does an ACCU value? Like how much? Yes.
I'll give you rough ranges.
Yes, I know it changes.
Financial Services License, and I'm not allowed to encourage people into these projects, but it's also not it's not right, because it's not necessarily between $35 and $40. If you just Google ACCU spot price, you'll find it. It's probably between 35 and 40 Australian dollars. There are other markets out there, and there are other buyers out there too. I have heard of carbon credits going for about $100 a ton over in the US for some voluntary projects, which is insane, right? The cost is interesting. It will vary depending on what you're doing. So I'll talk about soil carbon, and you might be able to talk about plantings. Plantings I think should be much more straightforward. Yeah, carbon will vary. Typically, the cost of the carbon project was about $20 per hectare to run a carbon project. So just do the maths on that. You're probably netting $15 a hectare. So that $20 a hectare will generally include sampling, your lab measurements, you're auditing somebody to come out and do it for you. A lot of what we're doing now is, under this program, will pre-arm you with a lot of the early phase of that, so that should reduce it even further. We are seeing costs come down quite substantially, particularly with a lot of this modeling stuff. A lot of the cost comes in addressing uncertainty, because again, this method is about trying to measure as accurately as possible. So the higher cost gives you more certainty on the results that you've got, which is what you want, because you do get discounting based on how accurate the measurements are and how many samples that you take. But about that $20 per hectare net is probably what generally we see a soil carbon project. That's the vicinity of it. But again, we are trying to reduce this right down for farmers, and we've been on this journey for the last 5 years. $20 a hectare was probably the five years ago. I think we've reduced the cost, but with inflation, it's probably still at $20. Inflation's great. Anyway.
Thanks, Sam. Before people start leaving the meeting, because we can stay a little bit longer, because I know we're on time now, I just want to let you know that we have the dates for the in-person workshops. I'm going to be sending out the invitations to everyone, but just in case someone has to leave, it's going to be, the first one will be in Culcairn on the 20th of August. It'll be an afternoon session, so it's going to be a Thursday, 20th of August for the people who are around that area. And then the next one will be in Urana the next day, the day after, on the Friday, the 21st of August. It'll be a morning session. I'm going to be confirming the venue, and I'm going to be sending out the invitation. So we can continue with the Q&A, and you are all welcome to stay longer, but I just wanted to give you that information before you have to be, jumping out of the meeting. So over to you, Katie. I think you wanted to make a...
Oh, yeah, good question, Katie. Yeah, $20. Sorry, no, $20 a hectare would be the total for the baseline. So think of it as $20 a hectare for the first 3 years, and then you're probably going back. You're just getting cheaper. Probably paying an extra, I don't know, maybe $5 a hectare after that. For the next round, you've got to factor in audit costs. It's about, let's say, $25 a hectare for the first 5 years, but it reduces significantly after that. The most expensive is doing the baseline and getting into it, learning everything you guys need to learn, doing enough samples, registering the project with the government, et cetera, et cetera.
Gary, you're on mute. Sorry, Gary, you're on mute.
He's finding his window.
Oh, yeah, okay. I'm not sure if I can unmute him myself. I cannot.
Oh, here we go. G'day, how you going?
Good, Gary.
You got me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes.
This is quite new to me, a format like this, and I'm a bit uncomfortable with it. I've written down a few things to take on, and I don't know whether I sound a little bit negative or not, but I think they're questions that most of the farmers on this screen are asking. And firstly is, why are we going down this path? That's the first question I'm asking. Why? Not what it's going to cost or all the formulation and all that sort of stuff. Why, as a farmer, should I go down this path? Is the first question. And how will becoming involved in a soil carbon scheme help our farm or the planet? Or is it just helping the government who's creating policy? So as a grower, that's sort of the fundamentals we're looking at. And then who benefits from the soil carbon scheme financially? Those that are organising it. So I suppose I'm just being a little bit, these are the questions that are asked when you go to footy training or you go to the pub from the farmers, generally, in my group anyway. And they're fundamental questions.
Yeah, no, I think they're very valid questions, Gary. And ultimately, we've been on this journey for a little while now with the whole carbon market as an instrument in the market, sort of starting back in 2012-15 sort of window. And we've seen that all evolve. And really, I think the mentality around it has evolved as well. What was originally seen as somewhat perceived as a bit of a get-rich-quick scheme. It's certainly not that. But ultimately, when we talk to many growers and certainly different businesses around where the interest is coming from the carbon market, a lot of the discussion is aligning with where they see their business in the next 5 to 25 years already. And many of that discussion is around, well, much of that discussion is revolving around, we're trying to leave the land in a better position than what we started with. We want to improve X, Y, Z in the landscape, whether it's soil, biodiversity, trees, whatever it is, and say, well, how would you go about doing that anyway if you were to truly benchmark your property and track that over time? And I think going in with that sort of approach positions you ultimately in a spot where it will be beneficial for your farm business and not something that should be seen as such a concern, which it can be perceived as. And ultimately, so with a soil carbon project, much of the additionality is all framed around is saying, look at your own farm business and say, well, if we've been in the production in the space of growing plants for the last 100 years, where is my soil carbon level now? Where does it potentially start at? And why am I not building carbon year on year if we all think that is what our main game here is either increasing or preserving the soil carbon that we've got? And critically with that, we see, so what are some major limitations to building carbon is ultimately building biomass and stabilizing that carbon is linked back to how that's going to cycle through the system. So from that biological health, chemistry, like nutritional value in the soil and the overall rotation and that husbandry of the landscape. And really it's trying to work out, it's saying that ultimately any of the decisions that you're going down to grow carbon in your soil should be geared around you increasing your overall productivity or stability in your production is ultimately what it needs to be aligned with, as opposed to the approach of saying, I'm going to do something completely different, back right off, go no touch on the landscape and hope for the best that soil carbon is going to answer it. Not at all. It's trying to structure this the same. How are you planning out your farm management over the next 5 to 25 years? And can participating in this be aligned with that? Who's getting the money out of it? Look, there have been a lot of project developers who have been snooping around the landscape, and their business is revolving around taking somewhere between usually 15 to 30% of the ACCUs generated as far as for registering, paying for the costs of the setup and development of the programs. They have certainly participated and have business models revolving around that. But ultimately, when you operate as a proponent yourself, you can generate the carbon credits and not sell them. You can sit them against your farm business. Essentially, they're essentially a bankable asset that's, you can either convert. Some people are offsetting against their own farm emissions and trying to be essentially inset or retire them against their own business. Others are looking to, try and sell them on to essentially be deducted off the national register to cancel out the greater emissions there. Ultimately, you can essentially run these projects like a big on-farm monitoring program with the co-benefit of being a ACCU being generated on that, as opposed to being like, we're just on the hamster wheel of generating carbon credits and we have to sell them at the end of that 5-year period. It's very much framed up around that. So
Gary,
it's kind of a roundabout way.
Ed gave me a good analogy yesterday, which I like, which I would actually to the overall. It's kind of like, and maybe you'll hate it, right? But it's kind of like it's like driving an electric car. So electric car's good. Yeah, pretty good for the environment, generally. I mean, if you reckon lithium mining, as long as you offset the lithium mining, you're fine. But range is getting better. The thing is, it's actually they're faster. There's far less maintenance. Longer term, they're much cheaper, but the outlay initially is there. As you set up, if you set up for it as an yacht solar, you can charge. You're not having to charge off the grid. You can use it as a supplemental battery. It's actually kind of makes more economic sense over the course of 10, 15 years than a nice car. But also then you factor into account the shocks that you've got from the next Middle East conflict and the current Middle East conflict, and all of a sudden it kind of starts to balance out, right? This is how I like in soil carbon projects, because carbon's going to store more water. We are going through this cycle now, and unlike the Middle East conflict, which was really hard to predict. We can predict that we're going to get less rainfall in a lot of the cropping regions across Australia. We're seeing this emergence of this, these crazy systems, more extremes. You guys are already experiencing this today.
No, from here.
It's and like I'm in Arvidale, right? Like it's just, I was looking at this today. This is our average yearly temperature in Arvidale from 1891 to 2025. I'm like, fuck, that's from 1972 to today, and it's just getting more and more wobbly, right? So this is where soil carbon, the agronomic effects, and I'm sure Kathleen could talk more about this. And I'm sure you guys, I know the LOS guys up in Northern New South Wales, talk a lot about the agronomic impact or benefit of having additional soil carbon and water retention, and just riding out some of these challenges and just evening off some of the variance that you get season to season, Gary. And that's what I'd say. It's like that electric car thing. You kind of see weathering the storm of the petrol diesel cycles, so weathering the storm of the next 10, 15 years and generating a little bit of revenue to subsidize those changes now.
I'll bite my tongue and let somebody else have a say. It looks like this carbon scheme looks like it might have the pitfalls and benefits of the general public being able to trade water to me. And as a grower, it concerns me a little bit that we're doing some heavy lifting, and industry, all they have to do is put their hand in their pocket to justify what they're doing as industry. Am I viewing that in an unrealistic way?
Talk to your local member.
Well, and that leads to the next question. Will change of government change the goalposts?
My view is we've got enough science to know the climate's going to be radically change over the next 30, 40 years. There's no technologies that are being developed right now that will change that fundamentally. So there's going to, and then pull back to the agronomic stuff. We need carbon in soil, provides resilience, helps feed microbes, helps sucking nitrogen from the air. We're
doing those things naturally, organically as farmers. I would have thought over the last 100 years, we've done some poor things as far as soil health is concerned, but we've also done a lot of good things. And we realise all those things, and we've realised them for a long time. And just to be financially benefited going forward without reflecting on the good work that some growers have done going back seems a little bit narrow-minded to me too. And I look at growers, they're like Peter Campbell there. He's had a huge understanding of the benefits of looking after your soil, and has been a huge proponent of doing so over his farming career. And for us to be presented with this under a short time frame, like I'm here to learn, and I'm here to be a better farmer, I suppose, about it all. And that's why I've put my hand up to participate in this. You're going to get a lot more questions from me, David.
No, it's excellent.
Thank you, Gary.
All really valid. Yeah.
I bet it's good. Let someone else have a say.
No, and this is what we want to generate through this project, to answer all the questions and trying to find the best way to support you through this very confusing sometimes journey. And we, as Riverine Plains, designed this project focusing on the productivity benefits we could generate through the carbon project designs first. And we're trying to see the carbon, biodiversity, and emissions as an added bonus. So that's what we have Ed and Sam and all the team. They're very good in doing this. So just putting the productivity and improving the efficiency of your business first, and then having the carbon and biodiversity, or whichever stream you choose to go through, as an added bonus and not as a burden for your business. So that's what we're trying to do with this project through this project in Riverine Plains. So that's the approach we're trying to take. We understand that it's a little bit of a burden sometimes, and it's very confusing. So yeah, feel free to.
Gary, I'd take just focus on the agronomic side. And I think just because, again, it's funny. So GX Lab is kind of half an agronomy. We just do soil sampling for everything, right? So we're not a carbon company. And a lot of the research and work we did came out of the University of Sydney Ag department there. We commercialize all of those tools. So we have this grounding in agronomy. Now, are you a cropper? Do you go a cropper or grazer mixed? Gary, what are you doing?
At the moment, we're 100% cropping.
Yeah.
We've certainly, in the journey, been involved with grazing, and just to give you a touch more to the point made earlier by others, we've done a lot of work through land care over the last 30 years too.
Yeah, and so you're in a great position because look, even though the bang for buck is you introduce grazing system, a grazing practice, you're going to get huge bang for buck, but there's just simple things like verbal rate line, address pH, do these small things.
We've been doing all that verbal rate stuff for 10 years. We've been liming for 30 years. We've been testing for 35 years.
And this is it. So you're one of those sustainable farmers. Like, this is the question Alistair had before, right? You've already been doing this because every time you increase that crop, the head of the crop by that much, you're increasing the roots by that much. And what does that mean? It means you get more soil carbon in the ground. So you can actually, this is why I say, if you focus on the agronomic side, if you're a cropper, you're already doing this stuff, continue to do it, invest in the technologies that are going to help you do it better. This is where the feasibility comes into it. If it's not worth the $20 a hectare to do the testing, don't bother. Just do your standard agronomic tests. If it is, and you can use it to subsidize an agronomic impact, hell, do that. That's the benefit, right? It's the growth, it's the improvement to the crop, and that's the pub test. Is it going to help me use more revenue at the end of the season for a lower input, or for am I going to reduce costs and increase my yield? Maybe that's the focus, not the carbon side. But yeah, that's what I'd be going. That's what I'd be chasing, Gary. Yeah, okay, we'll keep that lens. We'll have I'll have a chat to Ollie and Jade, and when they do their farm assessment too, we'll look at it through a cropping lens there too, mate.
Someone else had some comment. I've got plenty more questions written down, no worry. Someone else have a go.
Sure. Going to go. Well, it just occurred to me, see, I'm only a small operation, 1,000 hectares, so it cost me $20,000 to do the whole farm. And that is one of the smaller farms in the area. But it occurred to me, why wouldn't I choose a typical paddock or section of the farm, maybe 100 or 200 hectares, to get a baseline, if that was a representative sample of the rest of the farm? Is that an option?
Only for the feasibility. You could do that. In fact, what we see a lot of people do is, again, I'm going to come back to the electric car analogy, because we've got a hybrid, right? Because I live in Armidale, we travel out to Bums all the time. So I need a petrol plug-in hybrid. So I got a Mitsubishi Outlander hybrid. And it's great because it allows me to test out a 20 kilowatt electric sort of battery into town and back, and say, it's right for me. And then my wife's like, oh yeah, I want an electric car now. This is great. I'd say the same thing with these carbon projects. So you've got a couple of really degraded paddocks there, Alistair, and you're going to provide bang for buck. Look, 200 hectares, pretty good. That's a pretty good size. Into that as your first carbon estimation area, as your first project area. See how it goes, because you're going to have to manage that slightly differently, and enter another area as CEA2 later on, and another project later on, another project. So you take a slow sort of progression into the carbon scheme. You can do this hybrid approach. We just do one area first that is going to increase. Now, yet still complexities there in terms of what your emissions footprint is and how that changes, and it may not be feasible, because it might be better just doing it across the entire thing. But yeah, you certainly reduce the amount of measurement required to get started and get into these projects. So it is a common approach that we see across projects. Ben, have you got anything? Because you were showing the carbon estimation area maps there.
Yeah, well, we don't.
Yeah, you're
I'd
right.
only add to that, $20,000 is half a load of urea. And in other words, if we could see value in the 20,000 going forward, I'd see a lot of people doing it. I guess it's a question of, is that from an economic rationalist point of view, is there a benefit to the farm and its profitability in the future, or a benefit to our understanding of how to manage it better? Then the 20,000 is not so bad. If you put it in the light of all our other expenses, it's kind of a drop in the ocean, dare I say.
Are these crops or graze, Arsen?
Entirely. We've recently switched to 100% cropping from grazing.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. So, and back to what I was saying to Gary there too. So, if your additionality, and Ed can add to this, is filbrating these paddocks, bit lime, specific, application of urea in certain locations for boosted yield that you're not going to see otherwise, that's where you're investing the $20,000, right? Is what does that change? Now, can you get the same from agronomic testing? Because you don't have to. Again, you don't have to do that you don't have to register a project, so you can do it for significantly cheaper if you're just doing a bit of testing. Just looking at the change, you can probably do it through a few agronomic tests instead. But you're not going to get any ACCUs at the end of that. So maybe it's better jumping head into those because you're putting some skin of the game, some more money on the line. But up to you.
Yeah, no, and I think this is really into what Gary brought up and others brought up before. Been like, yeah, if this was around 30 years ago when I started, it would make sense that I was involved in it now. And I think the opportunity is now. You got to look back in 25, 30 years time and say, well, I've done X, Y, Z over that period, which you're going to plan out as part of your business changes over that time, and say, yeah, why wasn't this scheme around when I started? And really, it is just some of the best performing farms and landscapes aren't able to fully benefit from what they've done and invested in themselves over that time. And that's just the nature of the beast of the methodology as it is and as it stands. But yeah, from Alistair's point of view, yeah, that bite size, like ultimately for a property such as yours, I think that's where, if it was to say going down a soil carbon project to manage that cost, that's where they introduced the hybrid model, where they could then be doing a more intensive baseline initially, but then your subsequent costs, you only potentially be measuring one of those CEAs, the others will get modelled out from the satellite work and the like. So that just indexes that cost right down based on that going forward, but you still need a adequate baseline of soil samples for that.
Maybe to answer Katie's question really quickly, she's just asked if soil carbon's always changing and going up and down. What's the ideal time to do soil core testing? In the context of measurement, we would do a baseline at any time of the year, really. But I mean, ideally, you want it a little bit moist so you can actually drill into the soil. If the ground's like cement, it's a bit tricky. You're not going to get, and there's some physical reasons that you don't want to do a core and really, really hard soil. But we would then pick a few years later a date that is within a 30-day window of that initial date. And that's regulated. So you have to pick within that 30-day window because carbon is seasonal. In fact, still recording, so I won't show too much of this. But this is a granular look using a Roth C model, which is a carbon model over time. This is 2023, this is 2026. So these numbers, each of these is actually a date. It should technically be a date down the bottom. But you can see how carbon decreases. It goes up a little bit, goes down. We had a bit of low rainfall, then it goes up and it sort of starts to increase again. But these, you can there's a snapshot. In this case, the carbon's gone down for this farm due to management practice change or lack of. But there is this wiggle, this cycle. So again, this point here and this point here are about the same time. This point here and this point here, so you can see sort of goes down, goes up, goes down, goes up in line with the seasons. So carbon will absolutely wiggle. Your management practice is what changes the growth, determines whether it grows or not over the years. And that's why we measure over the course of several years. We don't just do every second month. We do year 1 and then year 3 year 4 or year 5 to try and capture the actual change, not the wiggle in between. Great question, Katie.
Thank you so much. Peter, would you, I think I saw you raising your hand before. Oh, all good? You are on mute, Peter. So you can just give me a thumbs up if you're okay and you don't.
It's good, I think.
Okay, that's all good. Yeah, so is there any more questions? So we've gone over 20 minutes. So if someone has to leave, just feel free to. Thank you so much for your time and
Thanks,
looking
guys.
forward seeing you in the in-person workshop. Have a lovely rest of the day.
No, thanks for your time,
Right.
everyone.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.